Smoke poured from the clay oven before she even knew her hands were trembling. When she pulled the loaves free, the crusts were black, hardened, bitter with the sharp scent of ruin. And the laughter started right on cue. It rose up from behind her, sharp as knives, coming from the ranch hands leaning in the doorway. Their smirks cut right through her. "So that's the fine wife from the East," one of them jeered, his voice bouncing off the kitchen walls. "Can't even keep bread from burning." Her cheeks flushed a deep, painful scarlet. Her heart hammered against the cheap apron tied too loosely at her waist. She clutched the tray to her chest, as if hiding the blackened loaves could somehow undo her shame. The dream she'd carried all those miles west, of starting fresh, of being more than just a name in a letter, a bargain sealed with a stamp, it cracked right then and there, just like the burnt crusts in her hands. For a single wild heartbeat, she wanted to run. Just drop the tray and run until this whole dusty, mocking world was behind her. But before the first tear could fall, a shadow filled the doorway, and all the mocking fell dead silent. The rancher stepped inside. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his hat pulled low over steady eyes that held no hint of cruelty. He didn't say a word. He just crossed the room, the sound of his boots firm on the floorboards, and took the tray from her shaking hands. He picked up the first charred crust, and the whole room seemed to hold its breath. He bit into it. He chewed slowly, deliberately, and then he swallowed. The corners of his mouth curved into a smile as warm and unexpected as winter sunlight. "Best bread I've had all season," he said. His voice was calm, but it carried to every corner of that kitchen. A ripple of pure shock ran through the room. The last of the laughter died in the men's throats, replaced by uneasy, shuffling glances. One of the hands tried to force a snicker, but the sound just withered and died under the weight of the rancher's gaze. He broke off another piece of the burnt bread, and he ate that too. His jaw was set, his smile was steady. It was an act of pure defiance. She just stared at him, her eyes wide, trying to understand. Why would a man like him, the master of this whole ranch, lower himself to eat what his own men mocked? The burnt crusts crumbled in his powerful hands, but not a single flicker of disgust crossed his face. There was only a quiet, solid wall of defiance that shielded her from their humiliation more powerfully than any weapon could. He was building a fortress around her with nothing but a smile and a mouthful of burnt bread. And as he handed the tray back to her, his smile lingered. "Bake again tomorrow," he said, his voice a low promise. "And I'll eat every crust you make." But as the others slunk away, their boots scraping the floor in their haste to leave, he turned back to her. The kindness in his eyes was still there, but now there was something else too. Something sharp and questioning. "Why are your hands shaking?" he asked softly, his voice meant only for her. The question pierced her harder than all their laughter combined, because it held no mockery, only genuine concern. She clutched the apron to her chest, her eyes darting to the oven that was still faintly smoking. Her lips trembled as she tried to find an answer. "Because I don't belong here," she whispered, the confession spilling out of her, raw and real. But the rancher didn't flinch. He just held her gaze, calm and unflinching, and took a small step closer. Not enough to crowd her, but just enough for her to feel the quiet strength that seemed to radiate from him like heat from a fire. "Belonging isn't proven in bread," he said, his tone as sure as the solid ground beneath their feet. "It's proven in how you rise after you fall." Her throat tightened. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, because in her entire life no one had ever spoken words like that to her. Back home she was measured in dowries and bargains, in whispered judgments about her worth. Never in mercy. She lowered her head, the shame washing over her again. "They'll laugh again tomorrow," she said, her voice bitter. "They'll laugh until I can't hear anything else." He reached forward, slow and deliberate, and his fingers brushed against the apron where her fists had wrinkled it. He smoothed the fabric flat with a touch so gentle it stole the air right out of her chest. "Let them laugh," he said. His voice was a low rumble. "Bread burns. It always has. But courage doesn't." She looked up then, her tears shining in the warm glow of the firelight. For the first time, she saw past the strength in his eyes, past the quiet authority. She saw a patience that felt ancient, a patience that felt as though it had been waiting for her long before she ever stepped foot through his door. She swallowed hard, her own voice barely a whisper. "Why would you do this for me?" The rancher's smile returned, quiet but unshaken. "Because a home is built on more than bread," he answered. The words sank into her like rain into parched earth. And though her cheeks still burned with shame, a tiny flicker of warmth sparked to life in her heart, a warmth that refused to be extinguished. But as he left her alone in the silent kitchen, the tray of blackened bread still on the table, a new feeling began to creep in. It wasn't warmth, it was suspicion. His kindness felt practiced, too perfect. The way he had silenced his men wasn't just with authority, it was with fear. She'd seen it in their eyes. They weren't just embarrassed, they were afraid of him. And his words, "A home is built on more than bread," echoed in her mind. What else, then? What was this home truly built on? She thought of the long ride west, the letter promising a husband and a home, the whispers of her family saying she was better sold than starved. She had been traded like a parcel, her worth measured in a signature on a piece of paper. She had expected cruelty, maybe indifference. But this calculated, overwhelming kindness felt stranger than either. It felt like a performance. Her lips trembled as she whispered into the silence, "Why does your kindness feel heavier than chains?" She pressed the apron to her face, breathing in the scent of flour and smoke, clinging to it like it was the last real thing in this world. Part of her, the desperate, lonely part, wanted to trust him, to believe that his smile was more than just pity. But another part, the part that had been shaped by years of betrayal, screamed a warning. Trust was just another word for risk, and risk had already cost her everything. She slid down against the cool wall, tucking her knees to her chest, the apron clutched tight in her hands. She whispered fiercely to the empty room, "I will not be fooled again." But even as she said it, her heart betrayed her. It held on to that warmth, that memory of his voice. A home is built on more than bread. And she had the terrifying feeling that she was about to find out what the other building blocks were, and that they were far darker than burnt crusts. Morning spread across the ranch with a pale golden light, stretching long shadows across the packed earth. When she finally stepped out of the kitchen, the cool air felt good on her hot cheeks, clearing away the lingering smoke and the stain of her tears. In the distance, horses nickered, their sleek backs glinting in the rising sun. The lowing of cattle blended with the steady rhythm of men starting their day's work. She stood on the porch, uncertain, the apron still clutched in her hand like a shield. She watched the world that was supposed to be hers, but it felt alien, pressing in on her, daring her to find her place. The same men who had laughed at her just hours before were out in the yard. They cast glances in her direction, some still smirking, others turning away quickly when they saw the tall, steady figure standing near the barn. The rancher. He leaned against a corral rail, his broad frame calm and solid in the morning light. And when his eyes lifted and met hers across the yard, there was no scorn. There was just a quiet acknowledgement. He had seen her at her most humiliated, and he hadn't turned away. Her heart gave a little stutter, caught somewhere between fear and a dangerous sense of relief. She tightened her grip on the apron, whispering to herself, "I don't know how to stand here." Then one of the men near the stable chuckled under his breath. A low, nasty sound. Before she could even flinch, the rancher's voice cut across the yard, not loud but sharp enough to carry. "You've had your jest. Get to work." The laughter died instantly. The air suddenly felt lighter, cleaner. The rancher's gaze followed her as she drew a slow breath, her shoulders straightening just a little, and stepped off the porch. The dirt crunched under her worn shoes. She paused in the middle of the yard, her eyes darting once more to the man at the rail. He gave her the faintest nod. It wasn't a command. It was a silent promise. "You are not alone here." Her throat tightened. She couldn't smile yet, not really, but the heavy weight in her chest eased just enough for her to breathe. She started walking, not towards the house, but towards him. She had questions, and his perfect defense of her had only created more. As she got closer, she saw that his knuckles were white where he gripped the wooden rail. He wasn't as calm as he looked. He was tense, coiled like a spring. "Do you know why I really ate that bread?" he asked, his voice low and steady as he fell into step beside her. They walked along the fence line, the cattle lowing softly in the field beyond. The question hit her like a sudden gust of wind, pulling the air from her lungs. She tightened her grip on the apron she'd slung over her arm. "To stop their laughter," she said, her voice brittle. It wasn't a question. He shook his head, the morning sun catching a faint, pale scar that traced his jawline. It was a line of history that made him look older than his years. "No," he said, his voice firm. "I ate it because I had to. Because if I hadn't, they would have known." "Known what?" she whispered, her heart starting to beat a little faster. He stopped walking and turned to face her, his eyes searching hers. "They were testing me," he said. "Not you, me. They wanted to see if I was weak enough to let them disrespect what's mine." The way he said "mine" sent a shiver down her spine. It wasn't romantic. It was territorial. It was the sound of a man guarding a border. "They work for you," she said, confused. "Why would they test you?" A dark look crossed his face. "Because their loyalty isn't to me. It's to the man who owned this ranch before me. My brother." She blinked, startled. He'd never mentioned a brother. The letter had only spoken of a man named Jacob, a rancher seeking a wife. "Your brother." He rested his hands on the rail, staring out at the grazing herd, but his eyes weren't seeing them. "He died. A year ago. I inherited this land, and these men came with it. They respected him. Me. They're still deciding." His voice softened, but it was heavy with a past she couldn't see. "Years back, I lost my wife to fever. After that, I left this life. I wandered. When I came back to take over this place after Jacob died, I was an outsider. Every mistake I made, every calf that was lost, every debt I carried was met with their whispers. Men out here don't forgive weakness." Her breath caught in her throat. She had been so wrapped up in her own shame. She had never imagined that this powerful man could have his own. "So you ate the bread to prove your strength?" "No," he said, shaking his head again, a flicker of something she couldn't name in his eyes. "I ate it because my brother would have, Jacob. He was a hard man. He would never let another man mock his wife, no matter what she did. It was the only thing I could do to make them believe I was him." A cold dread washed over her, so intense it made her dizzy. The words tumbled out of her mouth before she could stop them. "Believe you were him?" His gaze snapped back to her, sharp and sudden. He looked trapped. He had said too much. "It's an expression," he said quickly, but the lie was thin and brittle. "To live up to his name. That's all." But she knew it wasn't. She looked at him, the quiet strength, the hidden tension, the way he watched his own men like a hawk watches snakes in the grass. He wasn't just filling his brother's shoes. He was wearing a mask. and she was suddenly, terrifyingly certain that the man standing in front of her was not the man who had sent for her. He wasn't Jacob. She pressed the apron to her chest, her own tears forgotten. For the first time since leaving home, her shame was replaced by a far more powerful emotion: fear. She wasn't just a mail-order bride who couldn't bake. She was a stranger in a house of secrets, married to a man who didn't exist. And the men who had laughed at her, they weren't just cruel. They were watching, waiting for the mask to slip. Dust rose in little clouds around her feet as she stumbled after him toward the corral. Her mind was racing, trying to piece it all together. He wasn't Jacob. He was pretending to be his dead brother. Why? And who was he, really? The weight of a water bucket tugged at her arms, and when it sloshed over the rim, she bit back a cry of frustration. She was determined not to falter, not while he walked just ahead, his back straight and unreadable. He lifted a heavy gate with one arm, the wood creaking under the strain, and gestured for her to bring the bucket through. She hurried, the hem of her dress dragging in the dirt, and she nearly tripped on a loose stone. His hand shot out, his fingers wrapping around her elbow, steadying her before she could fall. "Easy," he said, his voice calm. He guided her forward with such effortless strength that the shame burning her cheeks for her clumsiness melted away, replaced by that cold knot of fear. She set the bucket down hard, water spilling again. "I can't even carry what you lift like nothing," she groaned, the words a weak attempt to fill the terrifying silence between them. His mouth curved faintly, a ghost of the smile he'd shown her before. "Strength isn't measured in buckets," he replied, taking the handle and tipping it gently into the trough. "It's measured in showing up again tomorrow." The words should have been comforting, but they weren't. They felt like a warning, a test. One of the ranch hands passed by, the same one who had jeered the loudest last night. He shot her a look, a smirk playing on his lips as he took in her wet skirt and clumsy posture. Before the man could even open his mouth, the rancher's voice cut through the air like a whip crack. "Get to work!" The man's smirk vanished. He lowered his head and practically scurried away, leaving the two of them alone in the soft haze of dust and sunlight. The power this man wielded was absolute, but it wasn't the power of a boss. It was the power of a predator. She bent to gather another bucket, her arms aching. But when she straightened up, she found his gaze fixed on her. He wasn't measuring her failure with the bucket. He was measuring her, reading her, trying to see if she had figured it out. "You don't have to prove yourself to me," he said gently. She froze, her lips parting, but no words came out. The lie was right there, sitting between them, thick and suffocating. "Then why did you lie to me?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Who are you?" His expression hardened, the gentle facade dropping away. The scar on his jaw seemed to stand out, whiter than before. "My name is Caleb," he said, his voice flat. "Jacob was my older brother." "The man I was supposed to marry?" she whispered, the world tilting under her feet. "Yes." "You said he died. How?" Caleb looked away, his gaze fixed on the distant hills. "An accident. A fall from a horse. It was quick." But his hands were clenched into fists at his sides. He was lying again, or at least not telling the whole truth. "Why?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why pretend to be him? Why not just send me back?" He turned back to her, and now his eyes were blazing with a desperate, raw intensity that frightened her more than his anger. "Because I can't," he said. "Because this ranch, Jacob's ranch, is tied to a debt, a big one. The man he owed, a cattle baron named Silas Thorne, he stipulated that the debt would be forgiven if Jacob produced an heir. The contract is ironclad. Without a wife and the hope of a son, Thorne takes everything." It all clicked into place. The letters, the urgency, the bride sent for from halfway across the country. It wasn't about love or companionship. It was a business transaction to save a dying ranch, and she was the key. So you took his place, she breathed, the scope of his deception hitting her. You took his name, and you took me. I had no choice, he said, his voice ragged. This land was all he had, all we have. I couldn't let Thorn have it. The men, they were loyal to Jacob. They wouldn't have followed me, Caleb, the younger brother who ran off years ago. But they'll follow Jacob. She stared at him, at this stranger who was her husband in name only, a man living a lie so profound it had swallowed him whole. The ranch hand's mockery wasn't just cruelty. It was a constant test. They were watching him, every second of every day, waiting for a crack in the performance, waiting for him to fail to be the man his brother was, and her burning the bread. It wasn't just a simple mistake. It was a threat to his entire charade. Her failure was his failure, and his failure meant ruin. Her throat tightened. The heavy bucket in her grip no longer felt like a simple chore. It felt like a chain binding her to his desperate, dangerous game. And for the first time, she understood that the laughter of the ranch hands wasn't the real threat. The real threat was Silas Thorne, the man who was waiting for them to fail, the man who would take everything if he discovered the truth. Her hands shook so violently as she untied the apron that evening that she nearly tore the strings. When it finally slipped from her waist, she clutched it to her chest like a shield. The tears she had been holding back all day finally spilled, hot and fast, down her cheeks. She stood on the porch, shadows stretching long and dark around her. "I can't do this," she whispered, her voice cracking in the stillness. The honesty of it, the sheer terror, startled her more than her own weeping. "I burn bread. I stumble with buckets. I am not the wife he expected. I will make a mistake, Caleb. I will say the wrong thing, or do the wrong thing, and they will know you're not him, and it will all be my fault." The words poured out of her like a dam breaking, years of being measured and found wanting, rushing into the night. Her knees felt weak, as if the weight of his secret might drag her right to the floor. Caleb stepped out of the yard and onto the porch. His boots were steady on the planks, and his shadow stretched across her as he stopped. His voice was low, certain. "You don't have to be the wife he expected," Caleb said, his voice deliberate. "You only have to be mine." She shook her head fiercely, pressing the apron harder against her chest until her fingers ached. "And what if that's not enough?" she cried, her tears falling onto the cloth, making dark patches like stains. "What if I can't be what you need me to be to save this place?" He crouched slightly, lowering himself to her eye level. The harsh lines of his face softened in the dusk light, his expression turning raw. "Then I'll stand beside you until you are," he said simply. The words were a vow, not of love, but of alliance, of survival. Her breath shuddered in her chest. She dared to lift her gaze to his steady eyes. There was no pity there. There was no trace of the laughter that had haunted her. There was only a calm, desperate devotion that frightened her more than cruelty ever could. Because it wasn't a lie. This part was real. He needed her. Her fingers slowly loosened on the apron. Her body was still trembling. The silence between them wasn't about a promise of love. It was the sealing of a pact, a dangerous conspiracy between two strangers, bound together against a world that wanted to see them fail. But that night she couldn't sleep. She lay in the small, stark room, the moonlight painting a silver square on the floor, and his words echoed in her head. An accident, a fall from a horse. It felt too simple, too clean. Men like Jacob, men who carved a life out of this hard land, they didn't just fall off horses. Driven by a restless fear, she slipped out of her room. The ranch house was silent, wrapped in the deep stillness of the prairie night. She didn't know what she was looking for, a clue, a piece of the truth, something to anchor her in this sea of lies. She found herself standing in front of a heavy wooden door at the end of the hall. It was the only one that was closed, locked. She jiggled the handle. It was solid, but the old key was still in the lock. With trembling fingers, she turned it. The click was deafeningly loud in the silence. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. It was an office, Jacob's office. It smelled of old leather, tobacco, and something else. Something metallic and faint, like old blood. A thick layer of dust covered everything, except for a strange, clean path from the door to the heavy oak desk. Someone had been coming in here recently. On the desk sat a leather-bound ledger. She opened it. It was filled with Jacob's handwriting, strong, slanted, impatient. Accounts, cattle counts, debts. She saw the name Silas Thorne again and again, the numbers beside it growing larger, more desperate. Then, tucked into the back of the ledger, was a letter. The paper was creased and worn, as if it had been read many times. It wasn't from Thorne. It was from a woman. Jacob, it read, you cannot do this. He is your brother. To use him as a shield against Thorne is a coward's act. He is not like you. This place, this violence, it will destroy him. If you have any heart left, send him away before it's too late, before Thorne finds out what you've really done. The letter wasn't signed. A cold sweat broke out on her skin. What you've really done. This wasn't just about a debt. This was about something Jacob did. Something so bad that Caleb was now being used as a shield. But a shield for what? Then she saw it. On the floor, mostly hidden beneath the heavy desk, was a dark stain on the floorboards. A stain that had been scrubbed at, but not completely removed. Her heart pounded in her chest. It wasn't an accident. Jacob hadn't died falling from a horse. He had died right here, in this room. She backed out of the office, her mind reeling. Caleb hadn't just taken his brother's place. He had lied about how his brother died. The whole story about the horse was a fabrication. Jacob had died violently, in his own office. And Caleb knew it. Was he covering for a killer? Or was he the killer himself? The man who had defended her so fiercely, who had offered her his protection. Was he a murderer? The long table stretched beneath the glow of hanging lamps, the yellow light pooling on tin plates and chipped mugs. The low rumble of men's voices filled the ranch hall as they gathered for supper. The air was thick with the smell of beans and fresh bread, bread she had baked herself, each loaf a pale, perfect gold. She stood at the end of the table, her new, clean apron tied securely, her hands folded in front of her. But her eyes darted nervously from face to face. She saw the men differently now. They weren't just crude ranch hands. They were witnesses, or maybe even accomplices. Did they know how Jacob really died? Were they part of Caleb's lie? The thought made her skin crawl. Their whispers still followed her, but the mockery was gone. Now there was a new kind of watching, a careful, assessing curiosity. They were trying to figure her out, to see if she was strong enough to be the rancher's wife, to be Jacob's wife. Caleb entered last, his stride as steady as ever. He took his place at the head of the table, and the room quieted. The tension was still there, a low hum beneath the clatter of forks and knives. He looked at her, and his eyes held a question. He knew she had been in the office. He must have seen the disturbed dust, the turned key. She carried a plate forward, her hands surprisingly steady this time, and set it before him. She placed a thick slice of the new bread beside his plate. The memory of the burnt loaves felt like a lifetime ago. That was a humiliation born of incompetence. This was a fear born of knowledge. One of the men down the table, a wiry older hand named Jed, cleared his throat. His eyes, small and sharp, were fixed on Caleb. "Heard a rider from Thorne's place was seen near the north pasture today, boss," he said, his voice casual, but the word boss was emphasized just a little too much. It was another test. Caleb didn't look up from his plate. "Let him look," he said, his tone even. Nothing to see but dust and cattle. Thorne's not a man who likes to be kept waiting, Jed pressed. He's expecting word about the arrangement. He glanced pointedly at her. The room went silent. Every eye was on Caleb. They were watching to see how Jacob would handle the threat. Caleb slowly lifted his gaze from his plate. He looked down the long table, his eyes calm, but with a fire burning deep within them. He reached across the table, took the perfect slice of bread she had baked, and broke it cleanly in two. "Silas Thorne can wait," he said, his voice ringing with an authority that silenced the room. "He'll get what he's owed when I'm ready, not before." He looked directly at her then, and the message was clear. "We are in this together." "She feeds this house," he said, his tone sharp as steel now, holding up a piece of the bread. "She holds this home together. Anyone with a problem with that has a problem with me. And as for Thorne, tell him my wife has arrived, and she is everything I expected." A hush fell over the room, heavy and absolute. The men lowered their eyes. They had their answer. Caleb had not just passed their test. He had crushed it. He had claimed her not as a bargain or a mail-order bride, but as his wife, his partner in this fortress he was building against the world. For the first time she lifted her head high. When her eyes met his across the table, she saw not pity, not desperation, but pride, and it rooted itself in her heart, a fierce and stubborn seed ready to grow. But as he held her gaze, she saw a flicker of something else in his eyes, a plea. "Don't ask me about the room. Don't ask me about the stain on the floor." Not yet. The lie was still there, a dark river flowing right beneath the surface of their fragile alliance. He was protecting the ranch. He was protecting her. But what terrible truth was he protecting them from? "Look at me," Caleb said quietly after the hall had emptied. His voice, now that they were alone, was strained. It carried the weight of the performance he had just given. Every man at that table had been watching him, ready to pounce on any sign of weakness, and he had met their challenge head-on. Her breath caught as her eyes lifted to meet his. The lamplight cast shadows across his face, making the scar on his jaw stand out. "You came here with nothing but a letter and a hope," he continued, his tone low and intense. "And they think that makes you weak, but I say it makes you braver than any man in this room." A tremor ran through her. "Why?" she whispered, her throat tight. "Why would you say that in front of them? Why would you tie yourself to me so completely?" His jaw set, his hand still resting on the piece of broken bread. His eyes did not waver from hers. "Because you are not shame," he said, his voice growing louder, stronger, echoing against the timber walls of the empty hall. "You are my wife, and I will not let them mock what I hold." The words were a hammer blow. Wife. Not a partner in a scheme, not a necessary piece of a contract. Wife. The declaration hung in the air, heavier than any ridicule, heavier than any lie. It was a truth he was willing into existence through sheer force. Her tears fell freely then, not from humiliation or fear, but from the unbearable, crushing rush of being seen, of being claimed. Her knees trembled. "You can't mean that," she whispered, her voice broken by the impossible hope fighting to bloom inside the ruins of her fear. His lips curved into the faintest smile, not soft, but unyielding, fierce. "I mean it more than breath," he said. "You are my choice." The silence that followed was so complete that she could hear the frantic beating of her own heart. Her chest ached with the force of it, with the desperate need to believe him. He had lied about his name, lied about his brother's death. But this felt real. This felt like the one true thing in this entire house of shadows. But the image of that dark stain on the office floor flashed in her mind. "The office," she said, her voice barely audible. "I was in the office last night, Caleb." The fierce light in his eyes died. The strength seemed to drain out of him, leaving him looking tired and haunted. He didn't deny it. He just nodded slowly, his gaze falling to the table. "I know," he said. "He didn't fall from a horse," she stated, her voice trembling. "He died in that room." Caleb closed his eyes. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken truths. When he finally opened them, they were filled with a pain so deep it stole her breath. "No," he said, his voice raw with a grief that was terrifyingly fresh. "He didn't fall from a horse." "What happened?" she whispered, afraid of the answer. "What did Jacob do? What did you do?" He looked at her then, and his expression was one of a man standing on the edge of a cliff. He could pull back or he could jump. He could tell her another lie or he could finally give her the truth. "Jacob," he began, his voice cracking. "Jacob wasn't in debt to Silas Thorne because of bad luck or a poor season. He was in debt because Thorne was blackmailing him." Her eyes widened. Blackmailing him. For what? Caleb took a deep, shuddering breath, as if the words themselves were poison. "My wife," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "The one I told you died of a fever. That was a lie, too. Her name was Sarah, and she didn't die of a fever." He looked up at her, his eyes hollowed out by memory. "Jacob killed her." The world stopped. The air in her lungs turned to ice. Jacob, the respected older brother, the man Caleb was impersonating to save his legacy, was a murderer. "What?" she breathed, unable to process the words. "Sarah found out what he was doing?" Caleb continued, his voice dead, monotonous, like a man reciting a story he had told himself 1,000 times in the dark. "Jacob was rustling cattle, not from Thorne, but from smaller ranchers, building his herd on their ruin. Sarah was going to expose him. She confronted him. There was a struggle. And he couldn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. He killed her, and he told everyone she ran off, that she'd left me. A year later, Thorne came calling. He'd found out somehow. He had proof. He used it to bleed Jacob dry. The debt wasn't a loan. It was blackmail, paid every month to keep Jacob from swinging from a rope." She sank into a nearby chair, her legs no longer able to hold her. The whole foundation of her reality had been ripped away. Caleb wasn't just a man living a lie. He was the brother of a murderer, living in the shadow of an unspeakable crime. "The letter," she whispered, remembering the unsigned note in the ledger. "He is not like you. This violence, it will destroy him." It was from someone who knew. "Our housekeeper, Martha," Caleb confirmed. "She's been with our family since we were boys. She knew what Jacob was. She tried to warn him to leave me out of it." "So what happened in that office, Caleb?" she asked, her voice shaking. "How did Jacob die?" He finally met her gaze again, and his eyes were clear, filled not with guilt, but with a terrible, righteous certainty. "I came back here a month ago," he said. "Not because I heard he was in trouble, but because I finally had proof of what he did to Sarah. I came to make him confess. I confronted him in that office. I told him I was going to the sheriff. He laughed. He told me Thorne would protect him, that his blackmail was the perfect insurance. Then he told me about you, that he'd sent for a bride, that his plan was to get an heir, and tell Thorne the deal was off. He was going to trap you here, use a child to save his own skin." Caleb stood up, his fists clenched at his sides. "He pulled a gun on me. He said he'd kill me just like he killed Sarah. We fought. The gun went off." He stopped, his breath ragged. "It was him or me. I didn't have a choice. It was self-defense." The dark stain on the floor. It wasn't just blood. It was the blood of his brother. "So you hid the body," she whispered in horror, "and you became him." "There was no other way," he said, his voice cracking with desperation. "If I'd gone to the sheriff, Thorne would have taken everything before the dust settled. He would have told the whole world that Jacob was a killer. The name my father built would have been turned to mud. This ranch would have died. So I buried him out on the ridge. And I told the men he'd gone to Denver on business. By the time he was supposed to be back, I had practiced his signature, learned to walk like him, talk like him. And then you arrived. He crossed the room and knelt before her, his hands taking hers. They were cold as ice. I know it's a nightmare. I know I've trapped you in a lie. But it's the only way to save this place, to get justice for Sarah. Once we satisfy the contract with Thorn, once this land is safe, I swear to you, I will burn the name Jacob to the ground and be Caleb again. We can be free. His words wrapped around her, a desperate plea and a wild promise. He wasn't a monster. He was a man pushed to the very edge, trying to build something good from the ashes of a terrible crime. He had killed his brother, yes, but to protect himself and to avenge his murdered wife. He had lied to everyone, but he had just told her the entire horrifying truth. He had trusted her with a secret that could get him hanged. She looked into his eyes, into the eyes of a man who had lost everything, and she saw the same quiet defiance he'd shown her on her first day. The same strength that had shielded her from mockery. He was still that man. He had just been forged in a much hotter fire than she could ever have imagined. Her tears had stopped. Her fear was gone, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. She squeezed his hands. "All right, Jacob," she said, her voice steady and clear. The name felt strange on her tongue, but it was the right one to use. It was their shield. "What do we do now?" His arms wrapped around her, strong and certain, and she felt herself steady, not as a victim, but as a conspirator, a partner. Outside, the wind shifted across the plains, carrying the scent of smoke and fresh bread. And in that silent, lamplit hall, the two of them solidified a bond, not of love, but of shared survival. Their fight wasn't over. It had just begun. The next few weeks were a blur of performance. She baked bread, mended clothes, and learned the rhythms of the ranch, all while playing the part of the devoted new wife. Caleb played the part of Jacob, the tough, respected rancher. They moved around each other with a careful, practiced grace, their conversations short and public, their true alliance hidden behind closed doors late at night. The ranch hands watched them, their suspicions slowly easing into a grudging acceptance. The new boss was as hard as the old one, and his wife, after a rocky start, was proving to be steady and capable. But the shadow of Silas Thorne loomed over everything. His riders were seen more frequently, always on the edge of the property, watching. They were vultures, circling, waiting for any sign of weakness. One afternoon, she was returning from the creek, a basket of washed linens on her hip, when she saw a rider approaching the house. He wasn't one of their men. He was dressed in black on a powerful black horse, and he rode with an arrogance that set her teeth on edge. It was Thorn. Caleb came out onto the porch, his body instantly tense, his hand resting casually near the pistol on his hip. She hurried to stand beside him, her heart pounding. Thorn reined in his horse, a cruel smirk on his face. He was an older man, but fit and strong, with cold, calculating eyes. He looked her up and down, his gaze lingering in a way that made her feel unclean. "Jacob," Thorn said, his voice smooth as oil. "I see the mail finally arrived. I was beginning to worry you'd lost your nerve." "My wife is no concern of yours, Thorn," Caleb said, his voice a low growl. Thorn chuckled. "Oh, but she is. She's the most important piece on the board, isn't she? The key to our whole arrangement." He tipped his hat to her. "Ma'am, I do hope he's treating you well. Jacob always had a bit of a temper." The veiled threat was unmistakable. He was reminding Caleb of his brother's violence, twisting the knife. "State your business, Thorn, and get off my land," Caleb said, his voice dangerously low. "Patience, Jacob, patience," Thorn drawled. I just came to deliver an invitation. I'm hosting a gathering at my estate in 2 weeks, a celebration of the season. All the important families will be there, and I expect you and your lovely new bride to be the guests of honor. It wasn't an invitation. It was a summons, a command. He wanted them on his territory, surrounded by his allies, where he could watch them, test them, and perhaps break them. We'll be there, Caleb said through gritted teeth. Excellent, Thorn beamed, his eyes glittering with malice. And do try to keep her from any accidents. It would be a shame if she were to run off, like your brother's first wife did. The words hung in the air, a declaration of war. He wasn't just blackmailing Jacob anymore. He was taunting Caleb with the murder of Sarah. He knew, or at least he suspected something was wrong. As Thorn rode away, she turned to Caleb. His face was a mask of stone, but she could see the fury and pain warring in his eyes. He's trying to provoke you, she said softly. I know, Caleb bit out. He wants me to slip up. He wants me to show him that I'm not Jacob. Then we won't let him, she said, her voice filled with the strength she didn't know she possessed. We will go to his party. We will smile and we will play our parts so perfectly that he will have no choice but to believe you. We will beat him at his own game. Caleb looked at her, and for the first time since he had confessed his terrible secret, he gave her a true smile. It was small and tired, but it was real. We will, he said. The night of the party was tense. The Thorn estate was a world away from their simple ranch house. It was a sprawling mansion filled with crystal chandeliers, polished floors, and people whose clothes cost more than Caleb's entire herd. They moved through the crowd, a united front, nodding and making polite conversation, while every nerve in their bodies screamed with tension. Thorn was the perfect host, but his eyes followed them everywhere. He introduced them to his neighbors, his business partners, his friends, and with every introduction he would make a small, pointed comment about Jacob's good fortune or his sudden change in temperament. Later in the evening, Thorn cornered Caleb by the fireplace, a glass of whiskey in his hand. She stood a few feet away, pretending to admire a painting, but listening to every word. You've changed, Jacob, Thorn said, his voice low. Marriage seems to have mellowed you. The old Jacob would have put a bullet in one of my riders by now for trespassing. I have more important things to worry about now, Caleb replied coolly. Yes, you do, Thorn said, taking a sip of his whiskey. You have a wife, a ranch, a legacy. It would be a shame to lose it all over a misunderstanding. He stared into the fire. You know, your brother was a fool. He had a good thing with Sarah, but he was careless. He left loose ends. I'm not so careless. It was a confession, a veiled, arrogant confession that he knew everything. He was telling Caleb that he held all the cards. But then he made a mistake. Your new wife is quite beautiful, Thorn continued, his eyes flicking over to her. But fragile. This country is hard on fragile things. It breaks them. Before Caleb could react, she stepped forward, a polite smile fixed on her face. Mr. Thorn, she said, her voice clear and steady, cutting through his monologue. I believe you misunderstand. I am not fragile, and this country, I find it agrees with me. Back east, a woman's worth is measured by her father's name or her husband's wealth. But out here, she paused, letting her gaze sweep over the opulent room. Out here, I've learned it's measured by what you can build and what you can protect. Thorn was taken aback, his smooth facade cracking for just a second. He had expected a timid, frightened girl. Not this. She leaned in slightly, her voice dropping to a near whisper. My husband and I are building a future, and we will protect it. From anyone and anything. She then smiled brightly, took Caleb's arm, and said, Darling, I believe they are starting the dancing. She led him away, leaving Silas Thorne standing by the fire, his whiskey forgotten, his eyes narrowed in a look of pure, unadulterated fury. He had underestimated her, and in this game, that was a fatal mistake. As they walked towards the dance floor, Caleb squeezed her hand. "You were incredible," he whispered, his voice thick with admiration. "I was terrified," she whispered back. "He knows," Caleb said grimly. "He doesn't have proof, but he knows I'm not Jacob. That whole performance was to tell me that he's in control." "Then we have to find his proof," she said, her mind racing. "The proof he was using to blackmail Jacob. If we can find it and destroy it, he has nothing." Their plan was desperate, bordering on suicidal. While Caleb kept Thorne occupied on the dance floor, she was to find his study and search for the evidence. She had no idea what she was looking for, a letter, a photograph, a sworn statement, but she knew she would recognize it when she saw it. She slipped away from the ballroom, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She found the study easily. A dark, wood-paneled room lined with books, smelling of cigar smoke and power. She lit a small oil lamp on the desk and began to search, her fingers flying through drawers, rifling through papers. She found ledgers, deeds, contracts, but nothing about Jacob, nothing about Sarah. Then she saw the safe hidden behind a heavy velvet curtain. It was old and iron with a complex combination lock. It was hopeless. She would never get it open. Defeated, she sank into the heavy leather chair behind the desk. Her hand brushed against a small, silver-framed photograph. It was a picture of a younger Silas Thorne, standing with a smiling woman. She picked it up, a strange sense of familiarity prickling at her. She knew this woman. With a jolt of shock, she realized who it was. It was the housekeeper, Martha, their loyal housekeeper who had been with the family for decades. But she was younger, happier, and she was standing with her arm linked through thorns. A floorboard creaked behind her. She spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. Silas Thorne stood in the doorway, a pistol in his hand. The polite host was gone. In his place was a predator. "Looking for something?" he asked, his voice dangerously soft. I was lost," she stammered, her mind racing for a way out. "No, you weren't," he said, stepping into the room and closing the door behind him. "You were looking for this." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. A sworn affidavit from a doctor in a town 2 counties over. The one Jacob paid to sign a false death certificate for Sarah, claiming she died of cholera. The good doctor had a crisis of conscience and a gambling debt. He sold his story to me. So that was it, the proof. But I have to admit, Thorne continued, his eyes glittering as he walked towards her, I'm impressed. You and Caleb. It's a better performance than I ever would have expected. For a while, you almost had me fooled. "You won't get away with this," she said, trying to keep her voice from shaking. Thorne laughed, a cold, empty sound. "I already have. Once I get rid of you and Caleb, I'll produce this affidavit. I'll tell the world Jacob murdered his sister-in-law, and his brother killed him for it. The righteous Caleb, a hero, but a hero with no legal claim to the ranch. The contract was with Jacob. With Jacob dead, the debt comes due. The ranch is mine." He raised the pistol. "It's a shame. I was beginning to like you." "Why?" she choked out, her eyes darting around the room, looking for any possible weapon, any escape. "Why go to all this trouble for one ranch?" Thorne's eyes flicked to the photograph in her hand. His expression twisted into something ugly, a mix of old pain and fresh hate. "Because of her," he said, his voice venomous. "Martha, before she was your doddering old housekeeper, she was supposed to be my wife. We were to be married. But Jacob's father, that sanctimonious old fool, he forbid it. Said my family wasn't good enough for his precious housekeeper. He drove her away from me and turned her into a servant. And Jacob was just like him. He treated her like dirt. This was never about the land. It was about destroying the legacy of the men who took her from me. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. This was a decades-old vendetta, a story of love, pride, and revenge. The door to the study burst open. Caleb stood there, his face pale, his own gun drawn. "Let her go, Thorn." Thorn just smiled. "I don't think so." He grabbed her, pulling her in front of him as a shield, the cold barrel of his pistol pressing against her temple. "Drop it, Caleb, or your new wife dies just like your old one." It was a standoff. Two men, two guns, and her life hanging in the balance. Caleb's eyes were locked on hers, filled with a desperate agony. He couldn't shoot without hitting her. He was trapped. But she wasn't. She looked from Caleb's desperate face to Thorn's triumphant one. Then she looked down at the heavy silver-framed photograph still clutched in her hand. It was all she had. "He's lying, Caleb," she shouted. "He doesn't want the ranch. He wants revenge. For Martha." She saw the flicker of confusion in Caleb's eyes and the flash of fury in Thorn's. He hadn't expected her to figure it out. In that split second of his distraction, she acted. With all her strength, she swung the heavy silver frame up, smashing it into Thorn's face. He roared in pain and surprise, his grip loosening for just an instant. It was all she needed. She threw herself to the side, stumbling and falling to the floor. A gunshot exploded in the enclosed space, deafeningly loud. She squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the pain. But it never came. When she opened them, Silas Thorne was slumping to the floor, a dark stain spreading across his chest. Caleb stood over him, his pistol smoking, his face a grim mask of shock and relief. It was over. In the stunned silence of the study, Caleb rushed to her side, helping her up, his hands checking her for injuries. "Are you all right? Did he hurt you?" She shook her head, leaning into him, her body trembling with adrenaline. "I'm okay." They stood there for a long moment, the chaos of the party outside seeming a world away. They had won. The lie was over. Thorn was dead. The proof of Jacob's crime was a worthless piece of paper on the floor. But they were standing over a dead body in the middle of a crowded party. "What do we do now?" she whispered, the reality of their situation crashing down on them. Caleb looked from Thorn's body to the gun in his hand, then to her. The hunted look was gone from his eyes, replaced by a calm, quiet resolve. "Now," he said, his voice steady and sure, "we tell the truth." He walked to the door and fired his gun into the air. Screams erupted from the ballroom. Within minutes, the study was filled with shocked guests, and then the local sheriff. Caleb didn't lie. He didn't try to hide what happened. He told them everything. He told them about Jacob, about Sarah, about the blackmail, and about Thorn's final fatal threat. He laid the entire ugly truth bare for the whole county to see. He placed his gun on the desk and stood tall, ready to accept the consequences. The next few days passed in a haze. Caleb was held in the town jail while the sheriff investigated. She stayed at the ranch, waiting, the silence of the big house pressing in on her. The ranch hands were quiet, their faces unreadable, but they kept the ranch running. Jed, the wiry old hand who had tested Caleb so fiercely, brought her a cup of coffee one morning. "He's a good man," Jed said, not meeting her eyes. "Jacob, we respected him, but we feared him. Caleb, he's different. He did right by you. He did right by us." It was the closest the old cowboy would ever come to an apology. Then the housekeeper, Martha, came to her. The old woman's eyes were filled with a deep, ancient sadness. "I should have told him," she whispered. "I knew what Silas was capable of. I never stopped loving him, but I feared him more. He was consumed by his hatred for your family." Martha confessed that she was the one who had been secretly visiting Jacob's office. She had found the letter she had written him, and in her grief and guilt, she would go in there and read it, torturing herself with what might have been. She confirmed every part of Caleb's story. Her testimony, along with evidence found in Thorne's study of his long and brutal history of threats and intimidation, was enough. A week later, the sheriff ruled the shooting a clear case of self-defense. Caleb was released. He rode back to the ranch, not as Jacob, but as Caleb, free. She was waiting for him on the porch. When he dismounted, he didn't walk towards her with the swagger of a victorious rancher. He walked like a man who was, finally, after years of running, home. He stopped in front of her, his hat in his hands, his eyes searching hers. "The ranch is safe," he said quietly. "It's mine now. Ours. If you'll have it." He wasn't offering her a deal or a pact of survival. He was offering her a life, a real one. "I was never nothing," she whispered, the words echoing what he had once told her. "And tonight, you became mine. Not because of letters, not because of bargains, but because I saw you and I chose you." A sob, laced with laughter, slipped from her throat. He pulled her into his arms, and she felt herself steady. Not in a house of lies, but in a home built on a foundation of hard-won truth. He had eaten her burnt bread to protect a lie, but in the end, it was the truth that had saved them both. Outside, the wind shifted across the plains, carrying the scent of dust and freedom. And in that quiet moment, on that simple porch, the two of them began a love that would be spoken of long after the embers of the past had cooled. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more tales of survival and unexpected courage. Now let me ask you, if you were in her shoes, would you have trusted the man who lied about his name? Or would you have run at the first sign of danger? Let me know in the comments below.